welcome to James Downar. Very thankful that he's found some time to present the complexities of MAID and organ donation. Most of you know James. He's well known in our field, but critical care and palliative care physician. Many might not know that he's moved from Toronto to Ottawa, and we're happy to have him here. He's really got a broad scope within the ICU with the palliative care portion, and also his master's in bioethics that he got out of the U of T. He sits on a lot of committees, for sure, very busy, and you know, I think things that are very important to us in ICU and donation specifically. For example, he's the chair of Ethics Affairs Committee at the Canadian Critical Care Society now, and others, and also very involved in research with tons of publications, and being first investigator for many grants. So, you know, he's really something that somebody we look up to, and we're really happy to have him here to start a conversation about MAID and donation. As usual, you can ask the questions on the chat line. We usually go through the talk first, and then have kind of a round table. But if there's anything burning, we can stop James along the way. James, all yours. Thanks for presenting today.
Oh, my pleasure, and thank you so much. A real honor to be invited to give this talk, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion towards the end. So I have some instructions. I'm going to first of all mute.
Yeah, he's going to mute all the calls, and remember at the end of the call that there's always Jahan's short 3-line survey about how we can do better.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello? Great, okay, thanks. Sorry, I apologize. I had to turn off the entry and exit announcements. That took longer than I thought. Now I'm going to mute everybody, and I'm going to get started, and then I'm going to unmute at the end. But please feel free to put questions in the chat box, and I will try to see them during the presentation and address them as I can.
The conference has been muted.
Conference has been muted. Here we go. So we're going to talk today a bit about medical assistance in dying and organ donation, and the timing of this was meant to coincide with the release of a document that came out just on Monday. You know, obviously hoping some of you may have seen that and maybe had a chance to read it in more detail. So we're going to go over some of the higher level stuff today during the talk, and again a chance to go into do a deeper dive into any of the aspects of the guidelines during the question period at the end. So disclosure from my end, I'm a former co-chair of the Physician Advisory Committee for Dying with Dignity Canada, which is a organization that was an advocacy group for the legalization of medical aid in dying. I no longer am an active member with that organization. I'm also employed by a faith-based institution, Briere Catholic institution, so I'm trying to not make any comments that would be seen to be advocating, you know, or promoting, so to speak, medical aid in dying as a result of that. And hopefully I don't really intend to do that ever, but hopefully I won't do that at all during this talk, and please call me out on it if I do. I have received speaker fees from various organizations that don't relate to this, and consulting fees around medical aid in dying instruction and mentorship networks from the organizations listed, but nothing related to this talk specifically. I want to acknowledge everybody who was on the planning committee that helped pull off these guidelines, and you can see them all here. Some of them, I think probably most of them are well known to all of you. I'm not going to go over them all and name them all and tell you about all of their fantastic personal accomplishments, but I can tell you that this was a real labor for all of the people involved here. Everybody contributed substantially to it, and it's an honor and a privilege to be presenting this on their behalf, but I certainly cannot claim to be the person who put in the majority of the work, or even you know, everybody played a vital role in this one, and I think it's just want to acknowledge that. We had a number of partners who were also involved in the development of the guidelines, including Canadian Society of Transplantation, Canadian Critical Care Society, Neurological Sciences Federation, and the Canadian Association of Critical Care Nurses. We did not have the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers officially as a partner, because they didn't really exist when we started this, or didn't exist as an organization, so to speak, and when we started this effort. And so, but they've been very supportive, I think, of these guidelines, and just presented to them last Friday, and was very well received by the group there. They're very keen to promote it and post it wherever they are found. Background, I probably don't have to give a lot of this information to people on this call, but the numbers that are used generally, 2,000 organ transplants a year in Canada, three-quarters of which were for deceased donors. Historically, deceased donation has been by two mechanisms, mostly neurological determination of death, but more recently in a growing proportion coming after circulatory determination of death. The standard model for organ donation, deceased organ donation, is a donor who is unconscious, is certainly unable to participate in the process of consenting for organ donation or discussing organ donation at the moment that it's being done. So all of this is typically done through proxy consent, usually as the result of advance directive or consistent with the wishes of the donor. More recently, there have been developments in Canada, including legalization of medical assistance in dying, which I will call MAID during the course of this discussion. Two different legal processes, Bill C-14 for most of Canada, Bill 52 in Quebec, following the Carter decision, of course, from the Supreme Court of Canada in 2015. At the same time, there has been an increasing number of requests from competent, conscious patients who are dependent on life-sustaining measures, who would like to have their life-sustaining measures withdrawn in the interest of comfort and palliation, but then learning that if they are eligible to donate their organs, that they'd really like to do that. So really sort of two separate streams of sort of previous scenarios that weren't really envisaged when the donation after cardiac or circulatory determination of death guidelines were developed back in 2006, is that you're getting these sort of contemporaneous first-person requests from conscious patients, and that's not something that people were very familiar with until fairly recently. So flooded with these sort of requests for guidance and assistance, Canadian Blood Services then set about trying to develop guidance to help the ODOs decide how to handle it. As part of a lot of background work, they did a number of, I think, very important things. One of them was to commission a poll to look at how Canadians viewed this issue. How do they feel about organ donation after death, depending on the circumstances of the death? And again, the purpose of this very busy slide is just to show you that, not surprisingly, Canadian public very supportive of the idea of organ donation in general, particularly the organ donation just in general. But even when you narrow it to organ donation after withdrawal of life support or organ donation after MAID, there's still a very, very large majority who are comfortable and strongly supportive of the idea of that should be practiced. When asked about the concerns they would have around this practice, the most common concerns were really about the risk of illness transmission. Like, could somebody with a potentially transmissible illness, like a neurodegenerative disease, potentially pass that on to a recipient? Also, understandably, people concerned that should there be a vulnerable person feeling pressure to withdraw life-sustaining treatment or choose medical aid in dying sooner than they might have otherwise, that there would be a concern. So it just, but in general, although in spite of these concerns, a very, very large proportion of people supportive. In terms of discussion, other issues around, organ donation, should this be mandatory conversation? Should everybody be offered the option of organ donation by default by a member of a care team prior to, at the time that they're considering or discussing their end-of-life options, regardless of their illness or their end-of-life decision? And again, very, very broad and strong support that people with any type of illness, people who are making decisions to withdraw life support or receive medical aid in dying, strong support for the idea that there should be a mandatory discussion about organ donation in that context. And then asked if you ever were in a position of needing an organ donated to you, would you be willing to accept an organ donated by an individual who had life support withdrawn or received medical aid in dying? And again, a very large proportion saying that they would be, and the usual Canadian quarter saying that they just don't know, they're undecided. But a small number, I should say, who were opposed. So we also went over to Europe and got their experience there. Medical aid in dying has been legal in Europe since 2001, 2002 in Belgium and the Netherlands, and they have started to have a fair amount of experience with organ donation there as well. They've gotten up to about, I think, 50-odd cases in the Netherlands. Again, in Europe, prognosis is less of a consideration. You don't actually have to have a limited prognosis to be eligible for medical aid in dying. It's really only based on suffering. It is potentially an option for people who are mature minors or those with primary primary mental illness, which again opens up the possibility of potentially a larger pool of donors, because most people who are eligible for medical aid in dying having advanced cancer would not typically be donors. From their experience, where they were doing medical aid in dying and organ donation, it occurs generally in an operating room. There have been a couple of case reports about it happening outside of an operating room or a hospital recently, which I'll talk about later. But again, it's a bit disruptive because in Canada, about half of medical aid in dying occurs in a healthcare facility, usually a hospital, and half of it occurs kind of in the community or at home. In Europe, that's more like 90% occurring in the home, so it's very much a community event rather than an acute care or palliative care setting event. And so the idea of having to do this in a hospital operating room is much more disruptive to the practices in Europe than they would be here in Canada. Again, they have a separate process whereby the patient consents to receive heparin at the time of MAID. Their death is diagnosed clinically. Again, they don't routinely put in arterial lines to ensure that circulatory arrest has taken place. They will use other non-invasive mechanisms like a aortic valve echo or ultrasound, establishing no flow in the arterial circulation. After 5 minutes, if the person is going to be donating their lungs, they will actually be intubated prior to being transported to the operating room for procurement if they're not already in the operating room, but they'll be intubated essentially immediately after 5 minutes once the person is declared deceased. And transplant centers in Europe, they all collaborate, as I'm sure you're all aware, in Eurotransplant, and transplant centers and recipient transplant centers will be informed that the organ was procured after MAID. It's a special category of organs, I believe category D or E, I think, under the Eurotransplant setting, and they are informed of that. I believe Dr. Eisbart mentioned that nobody's turned down an organ because they learned it came from MAID, but they're informed anyway. I'll talk about directed donation later. The data presented by Dr. Eisbart looked at, again, sort of 50-odd, 60-odd cases that have happened there. Very interesting. They've had a large number of organs from their donors. Again, as expected, mostly kidneys and liver, but double lungs, quite common as well. So in Belgium, about 2/3 were able to donate their lungs. In the Netherlands, slightly smaller number. But interestingly, all had primary function. There was no primary graft dysfunction in any of these situations, and I think that probably speaks to the ideal circumstances that you get with a MAID DCD, because the person dies so quickly after they go from having good circulation and oxygenation to deceased within a matter of short minutes, and so retrieval happens quickly. The early experience in Canada that was shared at our meeting then to develop the guidelines is that there was a slight difference of experience across the country. So in Ontario, MAID deaths are considered imminent deaths, which according to the Trillium Gift of Life Act would be a reportable event to Trillium if they're in an appropriate facility. And so this was considered something that would be routinely informed and then routinely offered to patients who met the eligibility criteria. In Quebec, they took a different approach where it's now what we call the double request. So it should not be raised by the healthcare team, but if the patient brings it up, then you can respond to the request. So in Quebec, it's the sort of, so to speak, double request. There was initially some discomfort from organ donation coordinators. Very sort of, I guess from a certain perspective, amusing story of, these are organ donation coordinators who are used to going into family meetings with very emotional, sad people dealing with the imminent death or actual death of a loved one, often suddenly, often unexpected, which is quite upsetting. And now they're being asked to get involved for a case where someone described phoning up somebody at home to arrange a time to talk about organ donation, and actually ended up the person who answered the phone was the person wishing to donate and saying, "Oh, thanks so much for calling, but hey, can I call you back in an hour because I've got some people over for a barbecue?" And this being quite a shocking thing for some of the coordinators who never had to deal with that scenario before, and it was a bit uncomfortable for them initially. The pre-donation testing and the logistics were considered to be quite substantial for some people. Again, when you're in an ICU connected to life support, we can get a whole bunch of information very, very quickly about the function of the organs, or at least how they look, getting some idea of how well they function. Somebody in the community, it's harder to do. So figuring out the logistics and understanding what tests need to be done and what tests probably don't necessarily need to be done was a major part of the process there. A lot of people raising questions about whether people with neurodegenerative disease were even eligible to donate organs, and that was a big question that came up a lot of people expressing some surprise that we didn't, that in many cases it was felt to be safe and wouldn't be an obvious reason why you couldn't do it. And then in some cases where there might be involvement of the coroner, depending on the mechanism of death, would that interfere in some way in the involvement? Because in Ontario, certainly, and in other provinces, the coroner is still involved in oversight, and you might want to just pre-clear before the MAID procedure that they don't want to investigate or seize the body for any reason, because that obviously might impair your ability to proceed with the organ donation. So in collecting all that information, we circulated it to the participants at the forum that took place a couple of years ago in Toronto, and there were participants representing a variety of fields which are listed here, including patient partners, and we had Dr. Shelley Sarwal join us by Skype from Halifax, who was she was again, this is all public information, so I'm not breaching confidentiality, but she was a physician who actually developed multi-system atrophy, and as she was dying, decided that she wanted to donate her organs, and actually participated and joined us by Skype to tell us about her experience and talk about some of the challenges that she'd had. So again, we broke out. We had presentations by experts, and then did small groups to discuss these sort of challenge questions that were set by the planning committee, and again, I had all the various different participants there. Some of the main topics of discussion at the forum I'll just present here for you, and then the main ethical concern that people identified is to say, look, I mean, obviously for some people, DCD might still be a bit of a controversial practice, although in Canada it's fairly standard now and not really controversial. MAID is still a controversial practice, even though it's legal and accepted in Canada. But if you accept that both of those things are legal and okay to do, is there an additional concern about combining the practice? And really, the idea is the major ethical concern here is that the one decision might influence the other. So take for example somebody with ALS who's saying, oh, I'm okay. As I get sicker, I just want to be palliated. I don't want to go on life support, but I don't want MAID. And then somebody says, oh, well, if you get MAID, you can donate your organs. Well, I definitely want to donate my organs. In that case, I changed my mind. I'd like MAID. And the desire to donate organs from people, it can be very strong, and the concern that might drive the decision in that direction. And of course, that's not what the MAID legislation was intended to do. It's not meant as a pathway for organ donation. It's meant to relieve intolerable suffering for somebody who meets eligibility criteria. And so we want to sort of try to figure out a way to make sure that one decision doesn't influence the other. And of course, is there a potential for undermining trust in the organ donation system by allowing this? Does this make people deliberately pessimistic about a prognosis to push them maybe to change a request to make withdrawal of life support so that they can donate organs, or maybe even to push them towards MAID? So that's one of the things that got discussed. Obviously, potential recipients who are opposed MAID, would they object to receiving an organ from somebody who's undergone MAID, which raises the question: should we even tell them that the source of the organ might be? We don't do that routinely for most other things, and we don't disclose those sort of circumstances. So that became an item of discussion. The effect on the patient that came up was this sort of need for hospital death and the various different pre-donation investigations that needed to take place. For somebody who's really proceeding towards the end of their life and hoping for sort of high quality time at home with family, this stuff can be pretty disruptive. And the idea that you're going to forego a nice comfortable MAID procedure in your living room, in your favorite lazy boy, or in your bedroom, in favor of having this in an operating room where your spouse can't even hold your hand, well, that's a big deal. And there was a Globe and Mail article about this happening for somebody in Quebec, and they interviewed the donor's widow, and she talked about that as being a bit difficult for her. But she understood and supported it, but it was still hard. How you monitor to ensure cardiac death if you're not putting an arterial line in somebody, we talked about that. And then the idea of having the review of literature around the risk of transmission of ALS and other neurodegenerative diseases, and Kristen Shoesmith was really instrumental in providing that insight. Conscientious objection obviously came up a fair amount, and the problem a little bit with conscientious objections is that it's something that people talk about a lot and raise, but the definition of it and the scope of it are not always as clear. So there's not a consensus around that, and in some cases, some people suggesting that those in professional roles really shouldn't have the right of conscientious objection around this, should really have effectively no limits to their conscientious objection, and this is a bit of a challenge to try to interpret how this would play out in a donation setting, right? So if you have the team that's managing the MAID procedure, and then you have a totally separate team that's managing the organ donation. Say somebody on that organ donation team is an objector and doesn't agree with MAID. Well, they're not actually involved in the MAID. They're only involved after the death of the individual. So strictly speaking, you could, from a certain perspective, the conscientious objection doesn't really even apply there. You're not in any way facilitating the MAID procedure or supporting it. You're simply saying that once this person is deceased, you're involved in procurement. On the flip side, people would suggest, well, if you're in any way involved in that, you're somewhat giving it some credence. You're giving it some legitimacy or validity by participating in a procedure that happens immediately afterwards, and that's a concern, obviously, for some people. In certain jurisdictions in Canada, and there are quite a few of them where there's some degree of a duty to refer, if you invoke your right of conscientious objection. So how can you ensure that you're referring the patient so that your objection doesn't actually impinge upon their right to receive the service, and in this case, the service being the right to donate an organ? Obviously, somebody who's in home or at long-term care, there's less available for testing and assessment than somebody who's in a hospital. Again, how do we make sure that they can choose the time and circumstances of their death rather than doing it at the timing of the hospital? Because most of the time for neurologic death, organ procurement happens at a convenient moment in the OR. Now you'd have to make sure the OR is free and make sure that you're ready to go, because this needs to happen when it's good for the patient. You also want to make sure they can plan around this for the final period of their lives. Make sure that you're managing whatever suffering is associated with the assessment process, and then obviously be sensitive to the burden involved in actually having to do this in a hospital and all the other various steps involved in incorporating organ donation into your end-of-life plans. Now, there were a number of recommendations that came out in the report. I encourage you to read it. It's available at the CMAJ website now and online. I believe CBS website, it will have a link to it as well, and Jan can confirm that. But the bottom line key recommendations is that medically suitable, conscious, and competent patients who provide first-person consent to end-of-life procedures should be given the opportunity to donate their organs and tissues. We were quite clear about that. In order to try to prevent one decision from influencing the other, we tried to say that these should be separate conversation. So the decision to proceed with MAID or withdrawal has to be separate from and must precede the decision to donate, right? So all that has to happen upstream. You don't discuss donation until somebody's decided for sure that they want to go ahead with MAID, and ideally that you even had one assessment done to make sure that they're eligible. Just to try to avoid that, you want those two conversations firewalled off in time, in space, and also in teams, that really anybody involved in MAID and withdrawal really shouldn't be involved in a discussion of donation, that those should be separate issues. At the same time, you have to make sure that the person is informed that they can withdraw consent for MAID or donation, either one, at any time, and the withdrawal of consent for one doesn't necessarily affect their consent for the other, right? So it's say withdrawal of consent for donation doesn't mean that they can't get MAID or withdrawal of life support. Some discussion also in the press, lay and scientific press, around the validity of the dead donor rule in a country where MAID is legal. Do you need to actually respect that? Or is there any reason that you should not be able to perform MAID by organ donation rather than do it by medication, wait till someone stops circulation for 5 minutes and then do procurement? And I think there was a lot of discussion back and forth around that. Why is it that when somebody wants to give a gift that you have to force them to sort of smash it a little bit first and then give it? I think was how one person put it. But at the end of the day, we thought that it was very important at this point to make sure that we uphold the dead donor rule and respect the dead donor rule, understanding that discussion may be going on for other reasons. The dead donor rule rule obviously has implications far beyond this issue, and we probably don't want to touch it, certainly not as part of these guidelines here. Vital organs can only be procured from a donor who's already deceased. Using determination of death, again, not just using the lack of a palpable pulse, but carotid ultrasound, Doppler, or aortic valve ultrasound, or even isoelectric ECG, and the idea that circulatory death has to be confirmed by a second physician after 5 minutes of no touch. There were some gaps, obviously, in unresolved issues. The idea of whether it should be routinely offered, should there be a routine approach to the potential donor versus should you only respond to patient requests? And again, that's the Ontario versus the Quebec approach. Should we allow the idea of directed donation, or does that create too much of a pressure on the donor, right? Knowing that if they withdraw their consent, that they're not just withdrawing the organ from a generalized pool, but they're actually going to be pulling their organ away from somebody who's known to them. And so there's a very specific attribution of responsibility there, which could potentially compromise somebody's free autonomy. What's come up very recently, and Johannes Mulder and Sonneveld published an interesting case series of 2 cases of patients who actually received made at home, more or less, with organ donation. So these were people who started the procedure at home with their loved ones around them. They were heavily sedated while they were still at home, then immediately put into an ambulance while unconscious, driven to the hospital for the remainder of the MAID procedure and the organ donation, and then following donation, they were returned, put back in the ambulance, brought home, and put back in bed where their family had been waiting, so their family can complete the grieving process, right? So that's an interesting new plan. I know that there's some work afoot to try to get that off the ground here in Canada too, and certainly might make a difference for some. And then the idea of follow-up of donations from patients with ALS, because we don't really have a lot of information on that, so we need that. I think one thing I want to share with you also is Shelley Sarwal's experience here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to put the sound very close so you can hear. It's just a couple of minutes of Shelley's experience going through this. I'm going to crank up the sound and hopefully you guys can hear it. Just send me a text if you can, because I know you won't be able to tell me, so just write a little message.
Hold it. Breathe, but don't move. Okay, nice and still again.
I wish we could go back to accepting death as just a natural part of life.
Big breath in again. Hold, hold. Excellent. Breathe away.
I was just diagnosed with multiple system atrophy. Parts of my brain are atrophying. They're just wasting away.
She had already known that whatever's going on was not reversible. I don't want to think about what it's going to be like without her.
For some people, having lost control by knowing they're dying, having that choice on how and when you die is the one piece of control they get. MAID has become an option.
I'm not looking at MAID as just as a way to end my life. To me, it's a way of ending my life at a time when I'm ready and how I want.
She wants to be a pioneer in doing the organ donation and trying to make sure that she can inspire others to do organ donation.
I've spent my life trying to help people, help patients, improve the medical system. That part of me just doesn't turn off.
When she was presented with the opportunity to do this, to be a pioneer, to be a teacher, she took it on.
Organ donation to me is the easy decision. I could save, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 lives. It's hard for me to say no to that.
She wants to prove that she can do or still do X, Y, and Z, and that she doesn't want to give those things up. So it's her way of fighting, not giving them up.
See on the other side. I don't want my legacy to be a thing. I'd rather that it's what's in people's hearts, how they remember me, and the way I led my life.